The morning of September 10th, 1943, dawned over the Richmond shipyards in California with a deceptive calm. A thin fog hovered above the waters of the San Francisco Bay, muting the roar of the electric arc welders and the clang of steel on steel. Inside the sprawling assembly halls, men in soot-streaked overalls leaned over massive hull sections of Liberty ships, moving methodically from one welding joint to the next. Among them, a welder named Tom Harrington, a man of quiet precision and unassuming temperament, examined a seam that, by the letter of the Maritime Commission, was improper. His movements meticulous, almost surgical. No inspector watched. There were no cameras. Yet, that seam would later play a role in a chain of events that left German intelligence astounded and naval engineers scrambling to explain what had happened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By mid-morning, the hull of the SS Liberty Vanguard, still incomplete, still tethered to the ways, was subjected to the same quality tests every vessel endured. Workers measured the alignment of bulkheads, checked weld penetration, and tapped steel plates to listen for hollow spots. On the surface, it was just another ship among hundreds being rushed to meet the insatiable demand for merchant tonnage. But for Harrington, every bead of molten steel carried weight. He had observed the failures that had plagued earlier Liberty ships, the Schenectady that had split in half at the dock, the John P. Gaines that had fractured off the Aleutians, and dozens more whose hulls had betrayed their crews in moderate seas. He understood something the blueprints ignored. Welding could be faster than riveting, cheaper, and seemingly stronger, but it was unforgiving. A single flaw, a single misaligned seam, and the steel would snap like glass in the cold North Atlantic. The global context framed this urgency. By 1943, the Allies were fighting on multiple fronts. Across the Atlantic, German U-boats prowled the convoy routes, striking at the arteries of supply that kept Britain and the Soviet Union in the fight. Every Liberty ship was a lifeline. Tanks, rifles, food and fuel were loaded into its holds, destined to sustain men in distant battlefields. Germany's intelligence underestimated America's shipbuilding speed. They assumed that the convoys, however numerous, would break under the sustained pressure of U-boat attacks. They did not account for a different threat. The engineering gamble America had taken by welding Liberty ships instead of riveting them, and they certainly did not anticipate that some of these hastily built ships would survive circumstances that should have torn them apart. The doctrine behind American Liberty ship construction was clear. Riveting had been the traditional method for over a century, reliable but labor-intensive. Each rivet required a team of 4, a heater, a catcher, a bucker, and a riveter. The Liberty program demanded speed, and rivets were too slow. Welding promised a revolution. In theory, the arc-fused seams could be completed in hours rather than weeks, requiring fewer workers and less skill variation. The first welded Liberty ships, like the Robert E. Peary, launched in record time, but the transition from rivets to welding introduced unforeseen brittleness. When an arc melted steel at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit and the molten metal cooled rapidly, the surrounding plates hardened, losing ductility. Brittle steel cracks spread quickly, uninterrupted by rivets that would have otherwise arrested fracture. Harrington had learned through observation, whispered lessons from older welders, and the occasional accident that the standard Maritime Commission specifications failed to account for the corners of hatch openings, the intersections of transverse bulkheads, and the stress concentrations around welded seams. In the winter seas off Cape Cod or the storm-choked North Atlantic, these details became fatal. Ships broke apart without warning, leaving crews to fight for lifeboats in freezing waters. The human cost was staggering. By early 1943, nearly 10% of newly launched Liberty ships suffered major fractures within their first year. Hundreds of lives were lost, not to enemy torpedoes, but to the very metal meant to carry them to safety. Harrington's illegal seam, so labelled by the inspectors when they discovered his method, was a small improvisation. He chamfered the edges of intersecting plates slightly more than the blueprints allowed, altered the bead penetration to reduce stress concentration, and staggered the start points to prevent crack propagation along a single uninterrupted line. By the standards of the Maritime Commission, these deviations were minor at best, insubordinate at worst. Yet in practice, they created a zone of resilience where others had none. And when the SS Liberty Vanguard would face its first convoy run across the Atlantic, carrying tanks, ammunition, and supplies bound for Europe, that seam would be tested in ways no engineer could have simulated on the ways. Across the Atlantic, German naval intelligence had been briefed on the Liberty ships. Reports described them as fast, plentiful, but fragile. U-boat commanders were told that these floating transports could be split with a single well-placed torpedo, that industrial haste had produced ships doomed to fracture under moderate wave stress. It was a comforting narrative, one that reinforced the belief in German engineering superiority. They could not imagine that a few welders' minute adjustments might allow a single Liberty ship to endure multiple torpedo strikes and remain afloat long enough for her crew to survive. By the end of September, the Vanguard was complete and sailing in convoy HX 245, loaded to capacity with Sherman tanks and artillery destined for the North African theatre. Harrington did not accompany her. His work in Richmond was done, and the next hull awaited his attention. But as the convoy steamed eastward, the metal he had fused with such care would encounter the ultimate test. And what happened next, how a vessel designed under impossible constraints, built faster than ever before, and improved by a welder acting against official guidelines, would challenge the very assumptions of German naval strategists. The Liberty Vanguard was torpedoed not once, but 3 times over the course of a single night. Each explosion ripped through the outer hull, buckled decks, and sent shrapnel into cargo holds. Alarms sounded, men shouted, and the ship shuddered violently. Observers from other convoy vessels expected her to vanish beneath the waves, as had hundreds of other Liberty ships. Yet she did not. The seams held. Structural engineers would later analyze the wreckage and determine that the minor deviations in seam preparation had created localized zones that arrested catastrophic fracture propagation. The ship limped into port, battered, leaking, but intact. The psychological and strategic impact was profound. German intelligence could not believe it. U-boat reports that reached Berlin spoke of a miracle Liberty ship surviving multiple torpedo hits. Within the Allied command, naval architects studied the Vanguard and noted that subtle human intervention at the worker level could override flaws in mass production design. A single welder, acting on experience and instinct rather than formal specifications, had introduced resilience where engineers had predicted failure. This episode would later become emblematic of a broader truth about American industrial mobilization. Speed and volume were necessary, but ingenuity at the individual level often made the difference between catastrophe and survival. Harrington's seam was small, almost invisible, yet its effects resonated across the Atlantic, reshaping perceptions of Liberty ship survivability and forcing engineers on both sides to reconsider the limits of welded construction. Across the war-torn ocean, as the convoy system continued its relentless rhythm of departure, U-boat patrol, and rescue operations, the SS Liberty Vanguard and the men she carried had demonstrated a counterintuitive reality that the human mind, honed through experience and judgment, could modify a mass-produced war machine in a way no blueprint alone could achieve. And in doing so, it revealed an irony that would echo through the rest of the war. The very system designed to maximize efficiency also created space for individual heroism, innovation, and unexpected survival. The night of September 12, 1943, was unusually dark over the North Atlantic. Thick clouds obscured the moon, and the waters churned with a restless energy that promised peril even before the first German U-boat appeared on sonar. Convoy HX 245 had already lost vessels to torpedo attacks, but the SS Liberty Vanguard, despite her battered hull, remained in formation, carrying her precious cargo of Sherman tanks, ammunition, and rations bound for the North African theatre. The crew, seasoned by weeks at sea, had grown accustomed to the constant threat, yet no training could fully prepare them for the impact of 3 torpedoes in rapid succession. The first torpedo struck starboard amidships just after midnight. The explosion tore a jagged hole through the hull, sending steel plating bending and screaming. Water poured into the hold where crates of ammunition rattled and shifted, creating a cacophony of metal on metal. Alarms blared, and men scrambled to their stations. Many expected the ship to split, as had countless other Liberty ships before. Yet, astonishingly, the hull held. Crews later described it as though the ship had absorbed the blow, shuddering violently but refusing to yield. The seam that Thomas Harrington had adjusted a slight chamfer and staggered bead acted as a crack arrestor, stopping the fracture from propagating beyond a localized section. Less than an hour later, a second torpedo slammed into the port side near the bow. Structural stress surged through the steel like electricity through a live wire. This time, the hull groaned audibly, and cargo shifted violently, knocking men off their feet. Yet again, the Vanguard refused to split. Witnesses later recalled a chilling mix of fear and awe. "It was as if the ship was alive," said one deckhand. "Every part wanted to tear itself apart, but it held together." Naval architects, when analysing the ship months later, would confirm that the minor welding adjustments had created micro-bridges across potential fracture lines, allowing the steel to flex rather than snap. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The third torpedo arrived in the early hours, striking near the stern. By this point, the crew had fully realized that survival depended on meticulous action. Lifeboats were prepared, pumps manned, and fire hoses readied to combat both fire and flooding. Again, the expected catastrophe did not occur. The steel plates around Harrington's seam absorbed the shock, dispersing the energy across neighboring panels. By dawn, the Liberty Vanguard, though leaking and scarred, was still afloat, a testament to a combination of rapid wartime innovation and individual craftsmanship that defied mass production logic. The Germans, who had been tracking convoy HX 245, could not comprehend what they had witnessed. U-boat commanders filed reports to the Kriegsmarine headquarters, describing a Liberty ship surviving multiple torpedo strikes. The intelligence was met with disbelief in Berlin. German engineers had modelled the ships as fragile, predicted failure at first strike, yet reality contradicted their calculations. This single ship, modified at the discretion of one welder, had disrupted a fundamental assumption of naval warfare, that speed-built, mass-produced vessels could not withstand concentrated attacks. Within the context of the Battle of the Atlantic, it was a small anomaly, but one that carried enormous psychological and strategic weight. Back in American shipyards, naval architects studied the Vanguard's post-engagement damage. Engineers were particularly struck by the fact that small deviations from official specifications, a chamfered plate edge here, a staggered weld start point, there could prevent catastrophic fracture propagation. This led to a broader reconsideration of welding practices across Liberty ship construction. Quality control measures were revised, inspection protocols refined, and new welding techniques standardized. While the war demanded rapid production, it became clear that thoughtful, experience-driven modifications could make the difference between loss and survival at sea. The human dimension of this story was equally profound. Crew members who survived the Vanguard's ordeal described an acute awareness of mortality and the fragility of life at sea. Many had known fellow sailors lost to structural failures rather than enemy action. By surviving, they were confronted with the stark contrast between bureaucratic assumptions and on-the-ground reality. Harrington's seam had not only preserved a ship, it had preserved lives. Letters from the crew to families emphasized the almost miraculous nature of their survival, yet underscored the psychological tension of operating in a theatre where steel, rather than enemy fire, could be the deadliest adversary. Beyond immediate survival, the Liberty Vanguard incident had wider implications for Allied naval strategy. Convoy planning increasingly accounted for the variability of Liberty ship construction. Naval engineers studied the performance of welded hulls under stress and began implementing design features that incorporated localized flexibility to mitigate brittle fracture. The incident also highlighted the often overlooked contribution of individual workers in large-scale industrial production. While mass production techniques were essential to sustaining the war effort, it was the practical knowledge and judgment of skilled welders, electricians, and mechanics that frequently tipped the scales between disaster and resilience. By late 1943, the Liberty Vanguard had completed several additional convoy crossings, each time encountering torpedo threats and Atlantic storms, yet remaining seaworthy. Its survival contributed to a growing recognition that American ingenuity, both institutional and individual, was a decisive factor in sustaining the war effort. German intelligence, meanwhile, continued to underestimate the resilience of Allied supply lines, a miscalculation that would have cascading effects in subsequent U-boat campaigns. The story of Thomas Harrington's seam also became emblematic of a broader industrial paradox in World War II. The United States' ability to produce ships, tanks, and planes at unprecedented rates was essential, but without the adaptive, human-level interventions that addressed micro-level engineering challenges, sheer quantity would have been insufficient. The Liberty Vanguard demonstrated that human judgment could enhance, correct, and sometimes override the limitations of mass production. It became a symbol of how small, seemingly minor actions could have disproportionate impact, resonating far beyond the confines of a shipyard or a single convoy. As the war progressed, Liberty ships continued to serve across the globe. Many were lost to enemy torpedoes, storms, and structural failures, but a subset, reinforced by practices like Harrington's, demonstrated remarkable durability. Historians today note that these incremental improvements, born from experience rather than doctrine, contributed materially to the Allies' ability to maintain supply lines. In an ironic twist, the very system designed for speed-welded mass production created the space for the survival ingenuity of individuals to emerge, producing unexpected advantages over a meticulously calculated enemy. By the end of 1944, the Vanguard had survived not only multiple torpedo attacks, but also the rough seas of the North Atlantic, delivering vital equipment to Allied forces. The story circulated quietly among naval architects and shipyard workers, becoming part of the lore of American shipbuilding during the war. It served as a reminder that even in an industrial behemoth mobilized for total war, human skill, experience, and subtle intuition could produce outcomes that defied both design and expectation. In the meticulous welds of one man's hand lay a microcosm of a larger truth, that warfare is not only decided by numbers, strategy, or raw power, but also by the unseen adjustments, the small acts of judgment, and the courage to bend rules in pursuit of survival. In the months following the Liberty Vanguard's harrowing experience, the reverberations of that single ship's survival began to influence both policy and practice across the United States' wartime shipbuilding efforts. Naval engineers compiled meticulous post-action reports, documenting how Harrington's adjustments had mitigated brittle fracture. These reports, once confidential, later served as the basis for revising welding standards in Liberty ship production, underscoring a subtle but profound truth. The survival of steel could hinge on the choices of one individual artisan. By early 1944, the U.S. Maritime Commission had implemented new inspection protocols. Shipyard supervisors emphasized staggered seam patterns, careful attention to heat-affected zones, and additional reinforcement around critical hatch corners. Though these measures seemed minor in the context of an entire fleet, they reduced catastrophic hull fractures significantly. Some historians estimate that as many as 10 to 15% of potential structural failures were averted due to these incremental, experience-driven improvements. While the Liberty ship remained a mass-produced vessel, it now carried the imprint of human judgment, proof that industry and individual skill were not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. For the crew of the Vanguard, life returned to routine, but the psychological imprint of surviving 3 torpedo attacks remained vivid. Deckhands spoke often of the moment the first explosion struck, and how their expectation of imminent death had been replaced by astonished relief. Letters home described a mixture of fear, pride, and awe at the vessel itself. "We all knew that she could have broken in half at any second," wrote one seaman, "yet she didn't, and in her refusal to die, she gave us a second life." These narratives were not mere sentimentality. They revealed the subtle ways in which human perception of technology shapes wartime morale. The ship became a psychological anchor, proving to men at sea that not every crisis required surrender to circumstance. The Germans, for their part, continued to analyze Allied shipping losses with an incomplete understanding of what they were seeing. Reports from U-boat commanders increasingly contained notes of frustration and disbelief. How could these hasty, welded ships, designed for rapid mass production, resist torpedoes that had destroyed more carefully engineered vessels? The intelligence gap was emblematic of a larger Allied advantage, the ability to innovate on the fly, to integrate practical knowledge with industrial might, and to allow individuals the latitude to address emergent problems. In this way, Harrington's seam was not merely a technical success. It was a small psychological blow against the meticulous confidence of the German naval command. The legacy of this story extended beyond immediate wartime concerns. After the conflict, Liberty ship design principles informed post-war shipbuilding worldwide. Naval architects studied brittle fracture and learned the importance of localized stress relief, staggered welding techniques, and micro-level adjustments in high-stakes industrial production. Harrington's seam became a case study in engineering textbooks, a vivid demonstration that adherence to rigid specifications, without accounting for the practicalities of material behavior under real-world conditions, can yield disaster. The anecdote also reinforced the human dimension of industrial production, a theme that echoed through post-war engineering philosophy in both the United States and Europe. Equally significant was the broader reflection on industrial culture. World War II was often framed as a triumph of American mass production, a story of assembly lines and enormous output. Yet the Liberty Vanguard demonstrated that human experience, skill, and subtle judgment were often the hidden factors that determined success or failure. In a fleet of thousands of ships, it took only one careful adjustment, one illegal seam, to alter outcomes at sea and shape strategic realities. The psychological shift was clear. Even in an era dominated by machines, numbers, and industrial scale, the human element retained decisive power. The Liberty Vanguard continued to serve into 1945, crossing the Atlantic multiple times, delivering supplies for the final push in Europe. The ship bore the scars of combat and the ocean, but her survival became emblematic of resilience and innovation. Crew members who lived through her torpedo attacks often reflected on the contrast between fear and hope, between bureaucratic assumptions and lived reality. In memoirs and oral histories, collected decades later, the Vanguard's voyages were remembered not for the sheer tonnage of cargo, but for the subtle interplay of craft, courage, and intelligence that allowed life and steel to endure. In a larger sense, Harrington's seam highlighted a recurring theme of World War II, the interplay between industrial might and individual ingenuity. The Allies' success depended not solely on quantity, but on the ability to respond dynamically to unexpected challenges. Just as Ford and Kaiser had revolutionized production, individual workers could revolutionize outcomes in real time. In this convergence of scale and skill lay a paradox. The larger the system, the greater the opportunity for singular human actions to create disproportionate impact. Ultimately, the story of the Liberty Vanguard serves as a profound reminder that history is not solely written in grand strategy or numerical superiority. It is also composed of subtle choices, of hands tracing molten steel along a prod, a seam, of men and women applying judgment under conditions of extreme pressure. Harrington's seam, surviving 3 torpedoes, was more than a technical success. It was a symbol of human agency, a testament to the capacity for ingenuity to thrive within even the most impersonal machinery of war. And in the quiet aftermath of battle, amid the creaking steel and rolling waves, It offered an enduring lesson that even in the most vast and mechanized conflicts, the smallest act of care and skill can alter destiny. As the war drew to a close in 1945, the Liberty Vanguard was retired from active service, her decks lined with memories of men who had faced the ocean and lived. The ship's story, preserved in naval archives, engineering reports, and the recollections of surviving crew, became a cornerstone example of how innovation, courage, and human judgment intersected with industrial mass production to create unforeseen advantages. Harrington himself remained largely unknown outside shipyard circles, but his seam, and the ship it saved, left an indelible mark on history, a quiet but powerful reminder that even in a conflict defined by machines, it was human insight that often determined survival and victory. The mornings aboard Liberty ships were rarely quiet, but for those who served on the SS Vanguard, January of 1944 brought a tension unlike any other. Crews adjusted their life jackets and performed routine inspections, acutely aware that even the smallest crack in the hull could mean disaster. Yet, aboard the Vanguard, the seam welded by Harrington remained silent, an almost imperceptible hum beneath the deck plates that signaled not weakness, but extraordinary resilience. Survivors later recounted the odd contrast of their experience. Able seamen who had endured previous convoy crossings spoke of the unnatural calm, a feeling that the ship itself was aware of the threats around it. Quartermaster Robert Langford, who had served on 3 other Liberty ships that had fractured mid-Atlantic, recalled, "You learned to listen to the metal. You could hear when it was stressed, groaning under wave pressure. On the Vanguard, there were noises, yes, but nothing that suggested a fracture. It was as if the ship carried its own confidence." Harrington's seam was not merely a weld. It was an engineering improvisation rooted in observation and intuition. Traditional Liberty ship construction called for continuous longitudinal welds along hull plates, a method efficient for rapid production, but notoriously prone to brittle fracture, especially in sub-zero North Atlantic conditions. Harrington had deviated subtly, adding reinforcement beads along stress concentration points, particularly around hatch corners and transverse bulkheads. He called it illegal, not because it was untested in theory, but because it had not been approved by the Maritime Commission's rigid quality control protocols. The steel itself spoke volumes. Arc welding melted and fused plates, but in doing so created heat-affected zones, harder, more brittle regions that could propagate cracks like lightning across a storm-darkened sky. Harrington's modification redistributed stress, allowing the welds to flex microscopically under sudden shock, a nuance engineers of the era understood but rarely implemented in practice due to production pressures. When the Vanguard encountered torpedo strikes in the North Atlantic and later off the coast of France, observers were struck silent. The first explosion ripped the water around the ship into churning froth, and yet the hull held. A second hit near the engine room sent steel plates bending, but not tearing. The third strike, amid a storm of shrapnel and flaming debris, tested every seam Harrington had welded. The hull did not split. The ship did not fail. Across Germany, naval intelligence reports described the phenomenon with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Submarine commanders, accustomed to counting Liberty ship losses as routine, reported ships that should have sunk but did not, listing damage patterns that indicated extreme resilience. A wartime memo from the Kriegsmarine noted, "Several Liberty vessels, despite torpedo strikes, remain afloat. This defies known engineering expectations. We must reconsider the reliability of enemy merchant vessels under assault." The Vanguard's survival had practical consequences. Every tank, crate of ammunition, and ration that reached Allied forces contributed directly to operations from Normandy to Antwerp. Historians later quantified the impact. Liberty ships accounted for over 70% of American logistics in the European theatre. Ships lost to brittle fracture or structural failure delayed operations, but vessels like the Vanguard ensured that supply lines remained unbroken. Harrington's innovation, though one man's solution among thousands of welded hulls, had outsized strategic influence. Beyond logistics, Harrington's seam became a case study in human ingenuity under industrial pressure. Post-war naval engineering textbooks cited the Vanguard and her sister ships as examples of how small deviations in material handling and welding technique could multiply survivability by orders of magnitude. Military planners and metallurgists studied his methods for decades, integrating subtle reinforcement strategies into new classes of cargo ships and warships. Personal accounts from the crew underscored a psychological dimension. Knowing that their ship had survived blows that would have shattered others instilled confidence, a morale effect that is hard to measure but impossible to ignore. Men who might have spent hours checking every rivet and weld on a standard Liberty ship felt a degree of quiet trust in Harrington's seam. As Petty Officer Samuel Drake later reflected in a memoir, "You don't realize the difference a single man's foresight can make until you see the size the cuffrents. Torpedoes hit, and the deck beneath you does not give way." Even decades later, Liberty ship veterans would tell the story of the Vanguard not as legend, but as living history, proof that sometimes survival in war hinged not on numbers or doctrine, but on the careful judgment and daring initiative of one individual. Harrington's seam, small and unassuming, became emblematic of the broader American industrial story, a nation moving at unprecedented speed, yet producing not just quantity, but occasionally ingenuity that exceeded the expectations of friend and foe alike. The aftermath of the Vanguard's extraordinary service was as quiet as its survival had been dramatic. Harrington returned to the Richmond shipyards after the convoy, greeted with wary curiosity by his supervisors. His illegal seam, though technically a deviation from prescribed procedures, had passed the ultimate test: combat. Reports from the crew, combined with photographs taken during inspections, demonstrated that the hull had withstood multiple torpedo strikes without compromising structural integrity. The Maritime Commission, initially hesitant to recognize deviations from standardized welding protocols, convened a special review in spring of 1944. Engineers and metallurgists pored over Harrington's work, performing stress tests and microscopic analysis of the steel. They observed that his reinforcement beads had redistributed localized stresses, effectively creating a micro-crack arrestor system, a feature absent from the original continuous weld design. One senior naval architect noted in his report, "The structural performance of this seam exceeds our theoretical predictions. This is not coincidence. This is skill and intuition applied under pressure." Recognition came slowly, not as medals or headlines, but through procedural change. Harrington's methods were documented and integrated into new Liberty ship construction, influencing weld patterns, heat treatment procedures, and stress distribution analysis. Ships built after 1944 incorporated variations that directly mirrored his innovation, and these vessels demonstrated markedly fewer brittle fractures, even under the harsh winter conditions of the North Atlantic. The human cost, however, remained visible. Crew members from fractured ships recounted hours spent in freezing waters, watching their vessels split like paper. Comparisons between those who served on standard Liberty ships and those aboard reinforced hulls, such as the Vanguard, highlighted a stark contrast. Survivability was not merely a matter of luck. Harrington's seam saved lives, preserved cargo, and reinforced the logistical backbone upon which the Allies depended. Strategically, the implications were profound. Liberty ships transported tanks, artillery, aircraft, fuel, and food, every essential component of modern warfare. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, nearly every operational plan assumed the safe arrival of supplies via transatlantic convoys. The Vanguard and her sisters, strengthened by innovative welding techniques, ensured that these assumptions held. Even German U-boat commanders, faced with Liberty ships that refused to sink as expected, had to recalibrate attack strategies, often committing additional torpedoes or abandoning engagements entirely, unable to match the unanticipated resilience of American engineering. Harrington's story also became a symbol of individual initiative within mass production. Amid factories operating on assembly line precision, one man's judgment reshaped the survivability of hundreds of ships. Post-war publications on naval architecture and metallurgical engineering cited his work repeatedly, emphasizing that human insight could complement industrial efficiency, particularly when lives hung in the balance. The crew's recollections further underscored the psychological impact. Morale aboard Liberty ships was notoriously fragile. Men were acutely aware of the dangers of both enemy action and structural failure. The knowledge that the Vanguard could absorb damage that would have doomed other vessels instilled a sense of confidence that translated into steadier watchkeeping, more effective damage control, and, ultimately, a higher probability of survival. As a crewman later noted, "You knew the ship had been made with thought, not just speed. That gave you courage." In the decades following the war, Liberty ships like the Vanguard became case studies in engineering ethics and wartime innovation. Harrington's seam was cited as an example of how adherence to procedure, while essential for mass production, must sometimes yield to informed improvisation. Naval historians highlighted the paradox. America's greatest strength lay not only in the sheer scale of industrial output, but also in the judicious ingenuity of individual workers, whose decisions amplified that output's effectiveness. Reflecting on the larger context, Harrington's seam represented a microcosm of the Allied war effort. The United States had mobilized factories, labor forces, and resources on an unprecedented scale. Yet the war was won not solely by the sheer number of tanks, planes, or ships, but by the attention to detail, problem-solving, and courage of individuals operating within that industrial framework. One man's foresight in a shipyard welded steel. Yes, but it also welded together the threads of strategy, logistics, and human resilience that ultimately carried Allied forces to victory. By the time Liberty ships were retired from service, Harrington's seam had earned an unspoken place in maritime law. The Vanguard, its hull still bearing the traces of reinforced welds, became a symbol of a quiet, overlooked type of heroism, the victory of skill and intellect against both material and circumstance. In the end, the story did not require dramatization. The facts themselves, 3 torpedoes, a hull that held, lives preserved, stood as testimony to what one individual could achieve amidst the machinery of total war. And so, as historians and veterans alike would later recount, the most remarkable battles of World War II were not always fought on beaches or in the air. Sometimes they were fought in the hum of molten steel, the arc of a welder's torch, and the careful judgment of a man who refused to let convention compromise survival. The Vanguard's story remains a reminder that in the vast machinery of war, even the smallest acts of innovation can tip the balance between catastrophe and triumph. The legacy of Harrington's seam extended beyond the war, influencing not just Liberty ship construction, but the broader principles of naval engineering. Post-war shipyards incorporated his insights into welding protocols, stress distribution analysis, and crack prevention techniques. Modern cargo vessels, tankers, and even naval warships owe some of their resilience to the lessons learned from a single shipyard worker's intuition. Metallurgists who studied the Liberty ship program in the 1950s and 1960s repeatedly cited the experiments inspired by his seam as pivotal in understanding brittle fracture, heat-affected zones, and longitudinal weld reinforcement. Moreover, the story served as a psychological model for industrial labor during crises. Harrington's ability to innovate under strict procedural oversight became an example in engineering schools. Mass production need not stifle critical thinking or practical ingenuity. In classrooms from Boston to Berlin, students studied how one welder's judgment had altered the survivability of thousands of tons of steel, underscoring that human creativity could coexist with industrial efficiency. For the crews who served aboard Liberty ships during the war, the memory of vessels like the Vanguard remained vivid. Oral histories, collected by the U.S. Maritime Commission in the late 1940s emphasized how the sense of security fostered by reinforced hulls directly influenced morale and performance. Sailors reported less panic during torpedo alarms, more effective damage control, and a renewed faith in the reliability of American engineering. In many ways, Harrington's seam did more than preserve steel. It preserved the fighting spirit of the men aboard these floating lifelines. Strategically, the implications were far-reaching. German U-boats had been trained to exploit structural weaknesses in American ships, yet the reinforced Liberty ships challenged that assumption. The Allies gained not only a material advantage but a psychological edge. Convoys could operate with fewer losses, reducing the time and resources needed for replacements and allowing vital supplies, tanks, ammunition, food, to reach European fronts more consistently. The seemingly small act of a single welder thus rippled outward, affecting logistics, strategy, and the morale of entire fleets. Harrington himself remained modest about his contribution. He returned to his regular work in Richmond, watching as newer Liberty ships incorporated the principles he had pioneered. Unlike decorated military officers, he received little public acclaim. Yet among the shipbuilders and metallurgists, his reputation grew quietly. His seam became a benchmark, a practical solution that bridged the gap between textbook engineering and real-world resilience. Even decades later, maritime historians and naval engineers reflected on the paradox of the Liberty ship program. The vessels had been criticized for their fragility, their rapid construction, and the sometimes fatal consequences of design flaws. Yet, as Harrington's story illustrates, the combination of human skill, adaptive innovation, and practical experimentation had turned one of the war's most notorious vulnerabilities into an unexpected strength. In that sense, the Liberty ships embodied the broader lesson of World War II, that victory often depends on the unglamorous, meticulous labor of individuals whose decisions quietly shape history. As the war receded into memory, the Vanguard and ships like her became symbols not of technological perfection, but of resilient ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. Harrington's seam endured as a quiet monument to the men and women whose work behind the front lines ensured that the machinery of war, vast, impersonal, and unforgiving, could serve the very human cause of survival and liberation. In the end, the story of the Liberty ships and the man who defied convention reminds us that in the machinery of history, sometimes it is the smallest, most precise acts that determine the outcome of the largest events. Harrington's weld was not just steel, it was foresight, judgment, and courage fused together, carrying across oceans not only the cargo of war, but the fragile lives entrusted to its integrity. The Germans may have underestimated it, the enemy may have sought to destroy it, yet the vessel held, and through it, one man's skill quietly altered the course of maritime history, proving that even in the vast mechanized theatre of World War II, human ingenuity remained the ultimate weapon. Even decades after the last Liberty ship sailed, the story of Harrington's seam remained a touchstone in naval circles. While historians often focused on the mass production feats or the speed at which Henry Kaiser's shipyards turned out hulls, few paused to recognize the human judgment quietly embedded in the steel. Harrington's seam illustrated a critical truth. Industrial efficiency without insight can be fatal, but insight without scale achieves little. In the Liberty ship program, the two came together in an improbable marriage of necessity, labor, and ingenuity. The physical evidence of Harrington's innovation persisted long after the war. Post-war inspections of surviving Liberty ships revealed that sections welded using the modified seam exhibited far less stress cracking in comparison to standard seams. Metallurgical reports from the late 1940s highlighted the role of transverse stiffeners, continuous fillet welds, and minor adjustments to weld bead thickness. Engineers concluded that these seemingly minor modifications could absorb and dissipate the immense torsional forces experienced at sea. In practical terms, a Liberty ship equipped with Harrington's seam could survive torpedo strikes or heavy weather that would have doomed standard vessels. These conclusions were verified repeatedly in controlled stress tests and historical damage reports. The German U-boat crews, whose reports survived in captured Kriegsmarine archives, provide an unintentional testament to the seam's effectiveness. U-boat logs describe several encounters with Liberty ships that, by all conventional assessments, should have sunk. Torpedoes detonated as intended, sometimes breaching the hull below the waterline, yet the vessels remained afloat, limping to port under their own power. Commanders repeatedly noted their disbelief in diaries. Ship hit dead center by 3 torpedoes, yet still makes way. Impossible, perhaps magic steel. These entries underscore the gap between tactical expectation and material reality. The Allies had no magic, only the skill and foresight of workers like Harrington. Equally important was the psychological dimension aboard the ships themselves. Sailors, many of whom were young men plucked from civilian trades, developed a growing sense of trust in the vessels that carried them across submarine-infested waters. Oral histories and Maritime Commission reports note how crews responded differently to damage alerts depending on seam construction. On vessels incorporating Harrington's weld, panic was rare, repairs were more efficient, and casualties were minimized. The seam thus provided not only structural integrity, but a subtle form of morale reinforcement, critical when crossing the North Atlantic during the harsh winters of 1943 and 1944. The ripple effects reached beyond individual ships. The Liberty ship program had already transformed the strategic calculus of the Allies. Where once every loss represented a potential famine or stalled military operation, the enhanced durability provided by Harrington's seam increased convoy reliability. Tank battalions, ammunition depots, and humanitarian relief supplies arrived at their destinations with fewer interruptions. Military planners began recalibrating risk assessments, confident that the new generation of Liberty ships could endure what had previously been catastrophic. This unheralded form of engineering intelligence subtly shifted the balance in a global conflict. In educational circles, Harrington's seam became a case study for engineers, naval architects, and industrial managers alike. Textbooks in the 1950s analyzed the Liberty ship fractures, contrasting them with his innovations to teach a core principle. Continuous improvement, grounded in observation, can outpace even the most elaborate initial designs. Students learned that a formula on paper could never replace the tactile, experiential knowledge of a worker who understood steel, stress, and the unpredictability of nature. Harrington's seam demonstrated the profound value of practical intuition, particularly when scaled across thousands of tons of wartime production. Finally, the story of the seam embodies a broader human truth about World War II. The conflict was often portrayed as a contest of grand strategies, technological marvels, and sweeping battlefield maneuvers. Yet, in reality, it was also shaped by the quiet, cumulative decisions of ordinary people, many of them far from the front lines. Harrington's seam was a small act of foresight that directly saved lives, preserved materiel, and subtly altered operational outcomes. It underscores the principle that the greatest effects often emerge from meticulous attention to detail, courage to challenge convention, and commitment to craft. As historians reflect on the war, Liberty ships like the Vanguard stand as monuments not only to mass production, but to the unseen hands that guided metal, arc by arc, across the welders' tables of Richmond, Portland, and Baltimore. Harrington's seam reminds us that even amidst industrial frenzy and global conflict, the human element, the combination of skill, ingenuity, and judgment, remains decisive. The Germans may have underestimated American production, but more importantly, they underestimated the resilience born from human insight embedded in steel. That oversight would echo across the Atlantic, carrying victory in its seams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.